subscribe to my channel or to my newsletter on sushantreddy.com